A Su-27 started a half-barrel roll at 200 meters, an altitude where the jet physically lacked the energy to complete the maneuver. The plane belonged to the Ukrainian Air Force. The chief pilot was Volodymyr Toponar, 27 years in the cockpit, 2,000 flight hours logged. His co-pilot, Yuri Yegorov, rode the back seat. The date was July 27, 2002, a clear summer Saturday at Sknyliv airfield outside Lviv. The crowd that afternoon numbered roughly 10,000 spectators. Within seconds, 77 of them would be dead, and 543 would be in hospitals across western Ukraine. The two pilots in the cockpit would survive. Here's what an oblique loop actually costs in pure energy. Every aerobatic maneuver an airshow pilot flies is a trade. The aircraft converts its kinetic energy, its motion, into potential energy, its altitude. To finish a half-barrel and recover wings level back at the runway, the Su-27 needs enough entry speed to climb through the inverted apex. If it loses too much airspeed at that apex, the rest of the maneuver doesn't exist. The minimum entry altitude depends on weight and thrust and on the geometry of the maneuver itself. Toponar started his roll low, with the aircraft heavy from its centerline drop tank. The thrust was below spec on the left engine, a maintenance issue investigators would later log and dismiss. The math at the start of the loop predicted the end of the loop. The math said the jet wouldn't finish. The Su-27 is powered by twin afterburning turbofans designed for sustained high-G combat at altitude. They weren't designed for low-altitude airshow geometry over a packed crowd line. At airshow speeds and airshow altitudes, those engines work, but the margin between the airframe's energy and the maneuver's energy demand collapses fast. With a heavy centerline tank and one engine running short, the energy budget going into the half-barrel was already tight. It was tighter than the demonstration script assumed. The math hadn't been done that morning, and it got done at the inverted apex by the airspeed needle. You can hear the moment in the cockpit recording. Toponar testified afterwards that during the half-barrel, he watched the airspeed bleed and the engine note drop. He kept pulling on the stick the whole way through. The Su-27 obeyed him in the most catastrophic way it could. The airframe let the airframe roll, but it wouldn't let the airframe climb. The jet pitched down out of the inverted apex with no altitude to spare. The left wing clipped a tree on the way down. The fuselage struck a parked Ilyushin IL-76 transport sitting on the apron. The airframe cartwheeled into the crowd line, and both pilots ejected 1 second after first impact. Now picture the K-36 ejection seat at the instant Yegorov pulled the handle. The K-36 is a Soviet design rated for 0 altitude and 0 airspeed, the gold standard in survival ejections. Its rocket motor pushes the pilot up and away from the airframe at roughly 18 g of acceleration. The seat's trajectory is independent of where the airframe goes after the pilot leaves. That independence is what kept Toponar and Yegorov alive. It also meant the airframe kept moving toward the crowd at impact velocity, while the pilots arced away on their parachutes. The asymmetry of the K-36's trajectory matters here in a specific way. The seat fires up and forward relative to the aircraft's axis, not relative to gravity. When the Su-27 was rolled past vertical at the top of the half-barrel, the seat's up pointed toward the ground. A gyroscopic stabilizer inside the K-36 corrects for that automatically. It orients the rocket motor before firing, so the pilot is always thrown clear of the ground plane. Without that stabilization, Toponar and Yegorov would have been driven into the surface alongside the airframe. Soviet ejection seat design specifically engineered against the failure mode that killed everyone outside the cockpit. An empty Su-27 weighs roughly 17,000 kilograms by itself. It hit the ground carrying that mass at low-altitude maneuvering speed, kinetic energy in the tens of megajoules.
The crowd line was 200 meters from the display zone, well inside the radius the burning fuselage would carve through. You're probably thinking the post-Ramstein rules should have prevented this, and they were supposed to. On August 28, 1988, the Italian Frecce Tricolori display team collided over Ramstein Air Base in West Germany during the Pierced Heart formation. The wreckage poured 300 gallons of ignited jet fuel into the crowd. The fire killed 70 spectators in seconds. Every European airshow regulation written after Ramstein attacked the same root cause, the crowd-setback distance. The Federal Aviation Administration's Advisory Circular 91-45 codified the same principle in the United States. The rule that Ramstein produced is simple to state. Spectators can't stand inside the aerobatic display box because no airshow pilot can guarantee they'll stay inside it themselves. The display box is the energy envelope the maneuver has to live inside. Push past the envelope and the airframe lands wherever its energy carries it. Sknyliv was a violation of that rule by geometry alone. The display zone was too small and the spectators were too close. The State Commission, chaired by Yevhen Marchuk, Ukraine's National Security and Defense Secretary, released its report on August 7, 2002, 11 days after the crash. It blamed the pilots primarily for the deaths. It also named the show organizers for the setback failure. And it named the pre-flight briefing process for the airfield layout confusion the pilots later testified to. The commission found that the briefing map handed to Topinar didn't match the actual airfield. He flew the maneuver geometry he had practiced for the briefing map. The geometry on the ground had moved. On June 24, 2005, a Ukrainian military court sentenced Topinar to 14 years in prison and Yegorov to 8 years. Yegorov's term was later cut to 3.5 years on appeal. The compensation orders ran to 7.2 million hryvnia against Topinar and 2.5 million against Yegorov. The court treated the crash as a criminal act, not a system failure. The Marchuk Commission's parallel findings about the show organizers and the briefing got buried in the prison sentence headlines. The post-Sknyliv reforms went deeper than the post-Ramstein ones did. Ukrainian Air Force display flying was suspended outright for nearly a year after the crash. Military aviation authorities across Europe and North America re-audited their display authorizations from scratch. The crowd line geometry became a hard pre-flight pass-fail check at every certified air show in Europe. It stopped being a recommendation a show organizer could shave off to fit more spectators along the fence. Topinar belonged to a Ukrainian Air Force display team called the Ukrainian Falcons. The Falcons had performed similar airshow routines many times over the prior year. Topinar's experience with the maneuver itself wasn't the issue at all. The issue was that the team had been booked to fly a maneuver geometry calibrated to one airfield envelope. They flew it on top of a different airfield envelope entirely. Nobody on the show side caught the mismatch before the engines started. That's the procedural gap the Marchuk Commission flagged in its findings. The Commission's report identified 4 contributing causes in total. The pilots failed first by deviating from the approved flight plan. The crew briefing failed second by handing them the wrong map. The left engine's thrust shortfall failed third, though investigators ruled it secondary. The crowd setback geometry failed fourth, and that's the one that mattered most. The fourth failure is what turned 77 spectators into casualties. Sknyliv is still the deadliest airshow disaster in human history. Ramstein had killed 70 spectators in a single afternoon. Sknyliv killed 77, injured 543, and 28 of the dead were children. The lesson the world's airshow community drew was identical to the one Ramstein had taught 14 years earlier.
The crowd line is the only line you can't break. The aircraft will always go where its energy actually lets it. If you stand inside the radius of a failure no pilot can rule out, the radius will eventually find you. Topinar and Yegorov had K-36 seats between them and the ground. The spectators at Sknyliv had nothing between them and the airframe except 200 meters of grass. If 77 spectators dying from a maneuver the airframe couldn't finish tracked you, the Chernobyl button video is right here on Sketchy Science.